Thalric Vensari had spent his entire career watching species kill each other, and he was very good at it. Not the killing, the watching. He was a strategic analyst for the Galactic Concord, one of the most respected military observers in Kelvori space. And in his 40 years of service, he had been assigned to observe 11 different species in active combat. He had seen the Thessan wage war with mathematical precision, calculating every shot before it was fired. He had watched the Drahesk charge into battle under the influence of chemical focus drugs that turned them into silent, efficient killing machines. He had studied the Ulmar, who fought with swarms of drones so thick they blocked out the sun. Every species had a style, a pattern, a way of war that could be measured, predicted, and filed away in neat little reports that made the Concord generals feel safe. When the orders came through for his 12th assignment, Thalric barely looked up from his morning meal. Humans. That was the species, humans. A young race barely 100 years into interstellar travel, recently admitted to the Galactic Concord as a provisional member. They had been granted permission to deploy a single battalion, alongside Concord forces in a joint operation, to reclaim the mining world of Acheron 7 from the Vreth Dominion. Thalric's job was simple: fly out, in bed with the human unit, watch them fight, and write a threat and capability assessment. He expected the assignment to last a few weeks at most. He expected it to be boring. He read the human dossier on the transport ship, and found it mildly interesting, but nothing special. High-gravity homeworld, with a toxic oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. That was unusual, but not unique. Endurance-based predators with binocular vision, standard for a mid-tier species. Moderate technological advancement, crude but functional weapon systems. Cultural tendency toward aggression. Again, nothing he had not seen a dozen times before. He closed the file, made a note that read Tier 3 species, likely unremarkable, and went to sleep. When the transport landed on Acheron 7's staging moon, Thalric gathered his observation equipment and walked down the ramp into the forward operating base. The Concord section of the base was exactly what he expected: clean, organized, quiet, with species from a dozen worlds preparing for war in their own careful ways. The Thessan were running probability models in their barracks. The Drahesk were meditating in chemical chambers. The Kelvori officers were reviewing tactical formations in perfect silence. Then Thalric walked into the human section of the base, and everything changed. The first thing that hit him was the noise. Music, loud, rhythmic, aggressive music, poured from speakers that someone had mounted on the walls of a cargo. Humans were everywhere, and none of them were doing anything that looked like preparation for war. Some were sitting in circles on the ground, eating from metal trays, and laughing so hard that tears ran down their faces. Others were painting symbols on their armor, crude images, words in their language, strange markings that seemed to have no tactical purpose. Two of them were wrestling on the ground while a crowd cheered. One was sitting alone on a supply crate, drawing something in a small book. Thalric stood at the edge of the human camp and stared. A voice broke through the chaos. "You must be our shadow." He turned and found himself face to face with a human female, Colonel Elena Vasquez, commanding officer of the 33rd Expeditionary Battalion, also known by a name Thalric found deeply unsettling: the Reapers. She was shorter than him by almost a full unit, with dark skin, sharp eyes, and a scar that ran across her left cheek. She extended her hand toward him, and when he took it out of politeness, she squeezed with a grip that made the bones in his fingers ache. Then she smiled. Thalric's blood went cold. Every Kelvori child learned from birth that a display of teeth was a threat, a warning, a promise of violence. He knew, intellectually, that humans smiled as a greeting, but seeing it up close, those white teeth bared in his direction, triggered something ancient and afraid inside him. "Welcome to the 33rd, Vasquez said, still showing her teeth. Try to keep up. Over the next 2 days, Thalric embedded with the humans and tried to make sense of them. He failed. Every species he had ever observed had pre-battle rituals that followed logic. The Thessan calculated. The Drahesk focused. The Kelvori meditated in silence, clearing their minds of emotion so they could fight with pure reason. The humans did none of these. Instead, they ate together. Massive communal meals where they passed food to each other and told stories. They told stories about past battles, about friends who had died, about homes they missed, and somehow these stories made them laugh as often as they made them go quiet. Some of them sang, actual songs, with words and melodies, about war and loss and something they called glory. Others played games with small paper rectangles, slamming them down on tables and shouting at each other in what appeared to be both anger and joy at the same time. Thalric recorded everything and understood nothing. He wrote in his nightly report, "Morale rituals appear primitive but effective. Unit cohesion is unusually high for a Tier 3 species. Recommend further study." On the second night, the joint tactical briefing took place in the command center. The Concord General, a towering Thessan named Vorith, presented the battle plan on a holographic projection display. It was a standard 3-phase siege, careful, methodical, and expected to last 40 standard rotations. Phase 1, establish forward positions. Phase 2, systematic bombardment of Vreth fortifications. Phase 3, coordinated ground assault. Every Concord officer nodded along. This was war as it was meant to be fought, slow, controlled, and predictable. Thalric watched Vasquez during the briefing. She stood in the back of the room, with her arms crossed, studying the holographic map with an expression he could not read. When Vorith finished, he asked if there were questions. Every Concord officer stayed silent. The plan was sound, and questioning a Thessan's mathematics was considered rude. Vasquez raised her hand. "Where are their supply lines?" The room went quiet. Vorith pointed to a network of underground tunnels on the southern edge of the map. Vasquez stared at those tunnels for a long time. Then she smiled again, that terrible, teeth-baring smile, and said, "Thank you, General." She said nothing else for the rest of the briefing. But Thalric saw something in her eyes that he had seen before, in the eyes of predators on a dozen worlds, the look of a hunter who had just found the trail. That night, unable to sleep, Thalric walked through the human camp. Most of the soldiers were resting, but 2 of them sat on ammunition crates near the perimeter, cleaning their weapons in the dim light. He stopped close enough to hear them talk. "Tomorrow's gonna be loud," one of them said, a young male with a shaved head and a tattoo of a winged creature on his neck. The other one, an older female with scars on her hands, laughed softly and replied, "Good, I hate the quiet." They both chuckled and went back to cleaning their guns. Thalric returned to his quarters and opened his report. He reached the species classification field, the same field he had filled in without hesitation for 11 previous species. The operation began on a gray morning, under a sky the color of ash, and for the first 2 days, everything went exactly as the Thessan general had planned. The Concord forces advanced in perfect formation across the broken terrain of Acheron 7, moving toward the mountain range where the Vreth Dominion had dug in their defenses. Artillery fired on schedule. Supply lines held. Forward positions were established without a single casualty. It was clean and orderly and precise, exactly the kind of war the Concord was built to fight. The humans spent those first 2 days in reserve, sitting behind the front lines, waiting. Thalric watched them from his observation post and noticed something strange. They were not anxious, not restless, not afraid. They were patient, the way a predator crouching in tall grass was patient. still on the outside but coiled tight underneath. On the morning of the third day, the Concorde identified a secondary target. A Vreth outpost built into the side of a cliff face, a hardened bunker complex with an estimated 300 defenders. It was considered low priority, a minor obstacle that the main force would bypass on its way to the primary objective. Colonel Vasquez volunteered her battalion to clear it. General Voreth agreed almost immediately, and Thalric could see the calculation behind the Thessan's many eyes. Give the humans a small task to keep them busy and out of the way. It was expected to take several rotations. Vasquez smiled when she received the order, and by now that smile made Thalric's stomach twist into a knot. She gathered her officers for a briefing that lasted less than 20 minutes, a fraction of the time a Concorde unit would spend planning an assault on a fortified position. Then she looked at Thalric and said, "You wanted to see us fight. Stay close and keep your head down." Thalric embedded with the human command element and followed them to the staging area, a kilometer from the outpost. The sun went down. The Concorde did not fight at night. It was considered inefficient, dishonorable, and unnecessarily dangerous. The humans waited for full darkness, and then they moved. Thalric watched from his observation drone as the 33rd crept forward through the black landscape like ghosts. They made almost no sound. The soldiers who had been laughing and singing and wrestling just hours ago were now utterly silent, moving with a coordination that seemed impossible for a species that had appeared so chaotic in camp. The first the Vreth knew of the attack was when the entire southern wall of the outpost exploded inward. Breaching charges, the humans had crawled to within meters of the fortification, in total darkness, and placed explosives on the walls without being detected. The blast was still echoing when the humans poured through the gap. Was something Thalric had never seen in all his years as an observer. The Vreth were a formidable species, armored insectoids that stood twice the height of a human, with 4 arms tipped in razor-sharp chitin blades and a natural exoskeleton that could stop light weapons fire. In any rational assessment, a Vreth warrior should have been able to kill 3 or 4 humans before being brought down. The humans did not seem to care about rational assessments. They moved through the outpost in teams of 4, clearing rooms with a speed and violence that left Thalric struggling to keep up on his displays. Breaching charges blew open doors, grenades followed, and then the soldiers stormed in, firing weapons that roared so loud the audio on his drone distorted. The Vreth fought back hard. They were warriors, bred for combat, and they did not break easily. But the humans did something that no Concorde species did. They advanced into the fire. A corridor was blocked by Vreth defenders pouring plasma bolts down the hallway. The humans did not pull back and wait for artillery support. They threw smoke grenades, charged forward, and engaged at close range where the Vreth's size became a disadvantage in the tight spaces. When a room was fortified, they did not spend hours planning a careful breach. They blew a hole in the wall from the room next door and attacked from a direction the Vreth never expected. When a soldier fell, the one behind stepped over the body and kept moving. Thalric zoomed his drone camera in on a young human female, a private, barely old enough to be out of training, who took a plasma bolt to her left shoulder. The bolt burned through her armor and seared the flesh beneath. She screamed, a raw animal sound that made Thalric flinch, and then she shifted her weapon to her right hand and kept firing. She did not stop. She did not call for help. She kept fighting, with one arm hanging useless at her side until the room was clear. And only then did she lean against a wall and let a medic look at her wound. Thalric stared at his screen and felt something he had not felt since he was a child. Genuine, primal fear. Then he saw something worse. A squad of 8 humans got pinned down in a corridor by heavy Vreth fire. 2 mounted plasma cannons creating a kill zone that nothing could cross. They were trapped, taking casualties, unable to advance or retreat. Their squad leader, a sergeant with gray in his hair and old scars on his face, looked at his soldiers, said something that Thalric's translator picked up as, "Cover me," and then stood up and ran straight at the plasma cannons. He ran directly into the kill zone, firing his weapon and screaming at the top of his lungs. The Vreth gunners shifted their fire to track him, and in those 2 seconds of distraction, the rest of the squad flanked left through a side passage and hit the gun positions from behind. The sergeant was hit 4 times before he went down. He was dead before he hit the floor. His squad completed the objective 30 seconds later. None of them stopped moving. When the last Vreth defender fell, the outpost went quiet. Thalric checked the time. 3 hours and 42 minutes from the first breach charge to the last shot. 300 Vreth, dead, every single one. Human casualties, 14 killed, 31 wounded. And here was the detail that made Thalric's hands shake as he recorded it. Every wounded human who could still stand refused evacuation. They stayed. They reloaded their weapons, wrapped their wounds with bandages, and took up defensive positions in case of a counterattack. One soldier, with a piece of shrapnel still embedded in his leg, limped to a firing position by a window and said to the medic trying to treat him. At the same time, Thalric pulled his drone back and sat in the darkness of his observation post, staring at the data scrolling across his screen. He had watched the Thessan dismantle an enemy with surgical precision. He had seen the Drahesk overwhelm a position with chemical-fueled fury. He had observed the Ulmar swarm a fortress with 10,000 drones. None of it, compared to what he had just witnessed. The humans had not fought like a military force conducting an operation. They had fought like something old and terrible, something from the deep past of a world that did not forgive weakness. He opened his report and began to type. Human combat doctrine does not account for acceptable losses in the way any Concord species defines the term. They do not retreat when casualties mount. They do not pause when soldiers fall. They advance into fire, adapt under pressure, and continue fighting through wounds that would incapacitate any other known species. Recommend immediate reclassification from Tier 3 to Unknown. Further observation required. End report. He saved the file and sat in silence. A sound behind him made him turn. Colonel Vasquez stood in the doorway of his observation post, still in her combat armor, still carrying her weapon. There was blood on her face, not hers, and her eyes held a strange, distant look. "You all right?" she asked. Thalric did not know how to answer that question honestly, so instead he asked one of his own. "How do your soldiers keep fighting after watching the ones beside them die?" Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was something Thalric's species did not have a word for. It was sadness, and pride, and fury, and love, all twisted together into something raw. "That's not despite watching them die," she said quietly. "It's because of it." She turned and walked back into the dark. Thalric did not sleep that night. He sat in his observation post and watched the humans through his cameras as they moved through the outposts they had taken. Some were carrying their dead to a clear area and laying them in neat rows, covering their faces with cloth. Some were sitting together in small groups, not speaking, just sitting close enough to touch. One soldier, the young private who had fought with one arm, was crying silently while another held her hand. And some, impossibly, were laughing, telling stories about the dead in voices that cracked between humor and grief, as if laughter and sorrow were the same thing to them. The Vreth counterattack came on the 5th day, and it came like a storm rising from the ground itself. The Concord's intelligence had estimated the Vreth garrison on Acheron 7 at roughly 15,000 warriors. They were wrong. The tunnels beneath the mountains went deeper and farther than anyone had mapped, and when the Vreth poured out of every crack and hole in the earth, they came in numbers that turned the horizon dark with armored bodies. Thalric was in the Concord Command Center when the first reports came in, and he watched the situation board turn from green to red in the span of minutes. The Thessan artillery positions on the eastern ridge overrun. The Drahesk shock battalions that were supposed to hold the center, broken and in full retreat. The Kalvori defensive lines on the western flank, crumbling under a wave of Wreth warriors that outnumbered them 10-1. General Vareth stood at the command table and did something Thalric had never seen a Thessan do. He hesitated. The plan was gone. The neat, mathematical 40-rotation siege was gone. What remained was chaos, and the Concord was not built for chaos. Retreat orders went out across every channel. Fall back to secondary positions. Regroup. Reassess. 3 species worth of soldiers turned and ran, and the Wreth surged forward into the gap, screaming their high-pitched war calls that sounded like metal scraping against stone. In the middle of this collapse, Colonel Vasquez's voice cut through the command frequency like a blade. 33rd Expeditionary to Concord Command. We are moving to the central ridge to establish a blocking position. We will hold the line while your forces withdraw. 33rd out. General Voreth's response was immediate. Negative, Colonel. You are ordered to retreat with the main force. The ridge is indefensible against those numbers. Vasquez's reply was calm and steady. Respectfully, General. Someone has to stay, or you lose the entire army. We will hold. 33rd out. She cut the channel. Thalric made a decision in that moment that he could not fully explain later. Instead of retreating with the Concord command staff, he grabbed his recording equipment and ran toward the human position. He found the 33rd already digging in along the central ridge, a long, rocky spine of high ground that overlooked the valley where the Wreth were pouring through. They had less than 400 soldiers, and the force coming toward them numbered somewhere between 10 and 15,000. The math was simple and terrible. Thalric set up his observation equipment on the back slope of the ridge and watched the humans prepare. They moved fast, faster than he thought possible. Within minutes, they had established overlapping fields of fire, placed explosive charges along the approaches, dug fighting positions in the rocky ground with tools and bare hands, and turned the ridge into something that looked less like a defensive position and more like a trap. Vasquez walked the line, speaking to every squad, every soldier. She did not give speeches about glory or duty or honor. She said things like, check your ammo and watch your spacing. And I need you sharp. Can you give me sharp? And every single soldier she spoke to answered the same way, with a nod, a grim smile, and the words, yes, ma'am. The Wreth hit the ridge 40 minutes later. The first wave was a probing attack, a few hundred warriors testing the defenses. The humans let them get close, so close that Thalric could see the individual plates of their chitin armor. And then they opened fire. The valley lit up with muzzle flashes and tracer rounds, and the first wave simply ceased to exist. The second wave was larger, 1,000 strong, coming up both sides of the ridge simultaneously, shifted their positions, redirected fire, and used the explosive charges to collapse the narrower approaches, funneling the Wreth into kill zones where concentrated fire tore them apart. The third wave was a full assault. Thousands of Wreth warriors swarming up the ridge from every direction, climbing over their own dead to reach the human lines. This was where any Concord unit would have broken. This was where the math said the humans should die. They did not break. Thalric watched through his cameras as the battle dissolved into close-quarters combat along the length of the ridge. Wreth warriors reached the human positions, and the fighting became hand-to-hand. Blades against bayonets, chitin claws against combat knives, brute alien strength against something that Thalric was only now beginning to understand. The humans were not stronger than the Wreth, not even close. A single Wreth warrior could tear a human apart with its 4 arms. But the humans fought with something that strength alone could not match. They fought with fury. When a Vreth warrior smashed through a barricade and killed 2 soldiers, the rest of the squad did not flee. They swarmed it, stabbing and shooting and hitting it with anything they could find, until it fell. When a position was overrun, the survivors fell back 10 meters, reformed, and counterattacked to retake it. When soldiers ran out of ammunition, they fixed bayonets and fought with steel. Thalric watched a human male, a corporal, average build, nothing remarkable about him, grab a Vreth warrior by one of its arms and hold on, while 2 other soldiers drove their knives into the gaps between its armor plates. The Vreth threw the corporal into a rock wall, so hard that Thalric heard the crack of breaking bones through the audio feed. The corporal got back up. He got back up with a broken arm and blood pouring from his head, his rifle, and kept fighting. And this was the moment when Thalric witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Vreth sent their heaviest assault yet up the center of the ridge. A column of elite warriors, the largest and most heavily armored, meant to punch through the human line and split it in 2. The human center began to buckle. Soldiers were falling, positions were being overrun, and for one terrible moment, Thalric thought it was over. Then the humans started to scream. Not in fear. He knew what fear sounded like. He had heard it from a dozen species on a dozen worlds. This was something else entirely. It started with one voice, a deep, raw, wordless roar, and then it spread like fire along the ridge until every human soldier was screaming. The sound was not language. It was older than language. It was the sound of a species that had spent 100,000 years fighting things that wanted to eat it and had won every single time. And then they charged. The humans left their defensive positions and charged downhill into the Vreth column. They ran directly into the mass of armored insectoid warriors, with bayonets and knives and bare fists, screaming that terrible scream. And the Vreth, a species that had conquered 12 worlds, that feared nothing in the known galaxy, hesitated. For 3 heartbeats the Vreth advance stopped. 3 heartbeats was all the humans needed. They hit the column like a wave of fury and broke it apart from the inside, fighting with a savagery that turned Thalric's stomach, and a coordination that left him in awe. But here was the thing that truly terrified him, the thing he would highlight in his report in red text that the Concord Council would read with shaking hands. Between the waves of Vreth attacks, in the brief pauses between assaults, the humans adapted, not over days or weeks. Way Concord Doctrine allowed for. Between firefights, in minutes, they noticed that the Vreth flinched at certain sonic frequencies, so they rigged speakers to blast bursts of sound that disrupted the Vreth's echolocation. They discovered that the joints beneath the Vreth thorax plates were vulnerable to angled strikes, so they modified their bayonet techniques on the spot, teaching each other with quick demonstrations while bleeding from their wounds. They realized the Vreth were using the tunnel entrances on the north slope for reinforcements. So, a squad crawled down under fire and collapsed the tunnels with their last remaining charges. Every single adaptation was invented, tested, and deployed in the middle of active combat by soldiers who were exhausted, wounded, and watching their friends die around them. Thalric had observed 11 species in combat. He had never seen anything evolve this fast under pressure. 19 hours. When the Concord forces finally completed their withdrawal to secondary positions, and the Vreth pulled back to regroup, the central ridge was soaked in blood, human and Vreth alike. Of the 400 soldiers who had dug in that morning, 137 were dead, and another 90 were wounded badly enough to need evacuation. The survivors, barely 200 soldiers, were already cleaning their weapons. They were checking ammunition counts, bandaging each other's wounds, redistributing supplies from the dead, and setting up new defensive positions in case the Vreth came back. A young soldier with blood on his face and someone else's bandage wrapped around his hand walked up to Thalric, who was sitting against a rock with his recording equipment clutched to his chest like a shield. The soldier held out a container of water. "You should eat something," he said, and his voice was hoarse from screaming, and from the dust, and from 19 hours of fighting. "Tomorrow's going to be worse." The Concord War Council met in a bunker 300 kilometers behind the new front line, and the mood was the closest thing to panic that any of these species would allow themselves to feel. General Voreth stood at the head of the table, his multiple eyes blinking in the pattern that meant deep distress, and presented the numbers. The Vreth forces on Acheron 7 were at least 4 times larger than initial estimates. Concord casualties in the counterattack were severe. 2 full battalions effectively destroyed, another 3 badly mauled. The timeline for the operation had gone from 40 rotations to completely unknown. Several senior officers recommended full withdrawal from the planet. Cut losses, abandon the mining world, and let the Vreth have it. Then Colonel Vasquez walked into the room. She had not been invited to the War Council. Humans held provisional status in the Concord, and their opinion on strategic matters was considered irrelevant. But she walked in anyway, and something about the way she moved, bruised, bandaged, still wearing armor that was cracked and stained with dried blood, both red and black, made every officer in the room go quiet. "I have a proposal," she said. Voreth's translator rendered his response as polite but dismissive. "Colonel, this is a Concord strategic session. Your input will be considered through proper channels." Vasquez looked the Thessan general in his 7 eyes and said, "With all due respect, General, your strategy is dead. Half your army is running, the other half is digging holes to hide in, and the Vreth are getting stronger every hour. You can either let us fight this war, or you can lose it." The silence that followed was absolute. Thalric, standing in the back of the room with his recorder running, held his breath. Voreth's eyes blinked rapidly, anger, calculation, something that might have been shame. And then he said, "What do you propose?" Vasquez stepped to the holographic display and began to speak, and what she described was something that no Concord species had a word for. Humans called it total war. She proposed simultaneous strikes on every Vreth supply line, command node, and tunnel network on the continent. Not one at a time, not in sequence, not with careful planning and measured force, but all at once, everywhere, with everything they had. She proposed attacks around the clock, dawn and dusk, midnight and noon, in patterns designed to be unpredictable, denying the Vreth any moment of rest or safety. She proposed targeting not just military positions, but the infrastructure that supported them, water supplies, communication networks, energy conduits, food stores. She proposed psychological operations, broadcasting captured Vreth distress signals on enemy frequencies, leaving dead Vreth in visible positions at the approaches to their own bases. Captured warriors, back to their hive, with messages that more were coming. A Kelvori admiral interrupted. "This violates at least 6 articles of the Concord Rules of Engagement." Vasquez did not blink. "Then change the rules or lose the war. Those are your options." Another silence. General Voreth looked around the table at his officers, Thessan, Drahesk, Kelvori, Ulmar, and saw the same thing in all of them. They were afraid, not of the Vreth, of the humans standing in front of them, telling them calmly and without apology that the polite way of fighting was going to get them all killed. "Very well," Voreth said. "The 33rd will lead the counteroffensive. All Concord forces will support." Vasquez smiled. Over the next 12 days, Thalric watched the humans transform the war. He had thought the outpost assault was intense. He had thought the ridge defense was the worst fighting he would ever see. Wrong. The humans did not just attack the Vreth. They dismantled them. Strike teams hit supply convoys in the dead of night, destroying food and ammunition stores and vanishing before the Vreth could respond. Demolition squads collapsed tunnel entrances across a 200-kilometer front, cutting off reinforcement routes and trapping thousands of Vreth warriors underground. Communication specialists jammed Vreth hive signals, breaking the psychic coordination that held their swarms together and turning organized units into confused, isolated groups. And the attacks never stopped. The humans fought in shifts, rotating fresh squads to the front line every 8 hours, so that there was always a unit ready to strike. Day and night, in rain and heat and darkness, explosions echoed across Acheron 7 as the 33rd, reinforced now with Concord units under human tactical direction, tore apart the Vreth war machine piece by piece. Thalric learned a new, human concept during those 12 days, breaking their will to fight. Every Concord species understood the idea of destroying an enemy's capacity for war. Eliminate their weapons, their soldiers, their ability to project force. The humans targeted something deeper. They targeted the enemy's desire to continue. The irregular attack patterns meant the Vreth never knew when the next strike would come. It could be minutes or hours, from the north or the south, a full assault or a single sniper shot that killed a commander and vanished. The psychological operations meant that every dead Vreth, every captured signal, every destroyed tunnel became a message. You are not safe, you cannot hide, we are everywhere, and we do not stop. Thalric watched the Vreth, a hive species that had conquered worlds, that had never retreated in recorded history, begin to fracture. Units broke formation and fled into the tunnels. Fearless aggression days ago, now flinched at shadows. The Hive Queen sent increasingly desperate signals to the Vreth homeworld, begging for reinforcements that would never come in time. On the 13th day, Vasquez launched the final assault on the Vreth Central Hive Fortress, a massive underground complex built into the roots of the tallest mountain on the continent. Concord Intelligence estimated it would take months to breach. Vasquez took it in 3 days. She used every trick the humans had learned: decoy assaults on the main gates to draw defenders out, infiltration teams crawling through drainage systems and ventilation shafts, electromagnetic pulses that fried the hive communication network and plunged the fortress into silent confusion. And then the main force hit from 7 directions at once. Thalric flew his observation drone through the shattered gates of the fortress and followed the human advance inside. Tunnels and chambers would visit him in nightmares for years to come. The Vreth fought with the desperation of a cornered hive. No retreat, no surrender. Every warrior throwing itself at the humans with claws and mandibles, and the frenzied strength of a species fighting for its queen. The humans matched them. Room by room, tunnel by tunnel, level by level, they cleared the fortress with the same terrible efficiency Thalric had seen at the outpost, but magnified 100-fold. He watched a human squad breach a chamber full of Vreth warriors and clear it in under 90 seconds. Grenades, gunfire, bayonets, fists. He watched a soldier take a chitin blade through the thigh, snap the blade off at the base, and use it to kill the Vreth that had stabbed him. He watched Colonel Vasquez, bleeding from a gash across her forehead that painted half her face red, personally lead the breach into the Queen's chamber. Most heavily armored Vreth warriors fought to the death. The humans killed every one of them. When the last guard fell, and the Queen raised her 4 arms in the universal gesture of surrender, the fighting stopped. And then something happened that shattered everything Thalric thought he understood about humans. The same soldiers who had killed without hesitation, who had charged into fire, and fought with their bare hands, and screamed that terrible war cry, they stopped. They lowered their weapons. Vasquez stepped forward, looked up at the Vreth Queen, a creature 3 times her size, dripping with ichor, surrounded by the bodies of her guard, and said, "It's over. Your warriors fought well. They will be treated with honor." Within minutes, human medics were moving through the fortress, treating wounded Vreth alongside wounded humans. Soldiers who had been killing Vreth warriors in hand-to-hand combat 10 minutes earlier were now offering water to captured enemies, bandaging their wounds, speaking to them in calm voices even though the Vreth could not understand the words. One human soldier, a massive male with a broken nose and blood soaking through 3 separate bandages on his torso, sat down next to a wounded Vreth warrior, shared his water, and said, "Hell of a fight, huh?" The Vreth stared at him with its compound eyes, mandibles clicking in confusion. Thalric stared too. He lowered his drone and stood in the ruins of the Queen's chamber, surrounded by dead and wounded from both sides, and watched the humans be gentle. His hands shook as he opened his recorder and spoke the final entry for the day. "I was sent to observe humans in combat. What I witnessed was a massacre. But the most terrifying part is not what they did, it is that they can stop. They choose when to be savage and when to be kind. They carry both inside them at the same time, like 2 creatures sharing one body, and they switch between them as easily as breathing. No species in the Concord can do this. No species in the Concord should want to." He saved the recording and sat down heavily on a piece of rubble. Around him, the humans were singing. The war for Acheron 7 ended not with a final battle, but with a silence that spread across the planet like a held breath. The Vreth Dominion sued for peace 3 days after the Hive Fortress fell, and the terms were negotiated in a tent on the scorched plains where the worst of the fighting had taken place. Thalric stood at the back of the tent and watched Colonel Vasquez sit across from the Vreth diplomatic caste. Tall, thin creatures, with none of the bulk of the warrior breed, but with eyes that held the cold intelligence of a species that had ruled star systems. The Vreth wanted to know one thing. What were the humans? Not their species name, not their homeworld coordinates, not their military strength. They wanted to know what kind of creature could do what the 33rd had done and then offer water to the survivors. Vasquez told them, "We are what happens when you push something that would rather be kind." Time then signed the surrender. The Concord celebrated its victory with formal ceremonies and diplomatic congratulations, the kind of polished, careful theater that galactic politics required. Medals were given, speeches were made, and the official history would record the Battle of Acheron 7 as a joint Concord success. Thalric knew the truth. Everyone who had been there knew the truth. Before the transport back to Kelvori space, Thalric attended a final meal with the survivors of the 33rd. It was held in the ruins of the outpost they had taken on their first night, the place where Thalric had first seen humans fight. Someone had set up tables made from ammunition crates, and the food was simple military rations, but the humans ate as if it were a feast. They laughed, they told stories, they raised cups of a dark bitter liquid they called coffee, and spoke the names of the dead. Every single name, one by one, followed by a drink and a moment of silence and then another story that made everyone laugh or cry or both. Thalric sat among them and felt something he had never felt with any other species he had observed. He felt like he belonged. Colonel Vasquez sat beside him, looking older than she had at the start of the campaign, with new scars on her face and a heaviness in her eyes that had not been there before. Thalric asked the question that had been building inside him since the first day. "Your species has been among the stars for barely a century. How are you already this effective at war?" Vasquez wrapped her hands around her cup and stared into the dark liquid for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "Because we have been at war with each other for 10,000 years. You just gave us someone new to fight." Thalric felt the warmth drain from his body. She continued, still looking at her cup. "Every tactic we used here, we learned fighting ourselves. Night assaults, siege warfare, psychological operations, total war. We invented all of it to use on each other. The Vreth thought they were facing a new species learning how to fight. They were actually facing the most experienced warfighting civilization in the galaxy. And we brought 10,000 years of practice. She looked at him then, and her eyes were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of someone carrying a weight she could never set down. We are very good at killing, Thalric. We always have been. But what makes us dangerous is not the killing. It is that we choose to be kind anyway. Because we know, better than anyone, what happens when you stop choosing. She raised her cup and said the names of more dead soldiers, and the humans around her echoed each name. And Thalric sat in the middle of it all, and understood, finally, why no classification system in the Concord could contain this species. They were not warriors who had learned. They were a compassionate species that had mastered war. And the difference between those two things was everything. The transport back to Kelvor Prime took 11 days, and Thalric spent every one of them writing his report. It was the longest document he had ever produced, 400 pages of tactical analysis, combat footage, biological assessments, and psychological profiles. But the part that mattered, the part that would be read by every senior official in the Concord, was the final assessment, and he rewrote it 9 times before he was satisfied. He presented his findings to the Kelvori Strategic Council in the great chamber beneath the capital, where decisions that shaped the fate of star systems were made in whispered tones under vaulted ceilings. The chamber was full, not just Kelvori, but representatives from every major Concord species, all of them waiting to hear about humanity. Thalric stood at the podium and began to speak. He told them about the outpost, the night assault, the 3-hour breach, the soldiers who kept fighting with broken bones and burnt flesh. He showed them footage of the ridge, 400 humans against 15,000 Vreth, holding for 19 hours, charging with bayonets when the ammunition ran out. He described the counteroffensive, the total war doctrine, the psychological operations, the systematic dismantling of a superior force through relentless, adaptive, unceasing aggression. He showed them the final assault on the Hive Fortress, and when the footage showed a human medic treating a wounded Vreth warrior with the same care she would give to her own kind, several members of the council had to look away. When he finished the tactical briefing, a Thessan counselor asked the obvious question: "What tier classification do you recommend for this species?" Thalric looked at the counselor and said, "Classifications are irrelevant." The chamber murmured. He continued, "You cannot classify a species that treats war the way humans do. They do not fight for territory or resources alone. They fight for each other. A human soldier will charge a fortified position alone, not because victory is possible, but so the soldier beside her might live one more day. You cannot model that with probability calculations. You cannot predict it with behavioral analysis. You cannot defeat it, because there is no threshold of casualties at which they stop. They do not stop. They never stop." The chamber was completely silent. "I have observed 12 species in active combat," Thalric said. "The humans are not the strongest. The Vreth are stronger. They are not the fastest. The Drahesk are faster. They are not the most technologically advanced. Every species in this room outpaces them. But none of that matters, because humans have something none of our species possess." Paused. "They adapt, faster than any species I have ever observed. They learn in the middle of combat, change tactics between firefights, invent new strategies with their backs against the wall and blood on their hands. And they do it fueled not by calculation, or chemicals, or meditation, but by something they call grit, which, as far as I can tell, is nothing more than a stubborn, irrational refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances." He took a breath. "The Concord has spent centuries building a framework for warfare that is rational, measured, and predictable. The humans do not fit inside that framework. They break it, and then they build something new out of the pieces. After the formal session, Thalric submitted the classified addendum, a document that would be sealed at the highest level of Concord security. It contained the most alarming finding of his entire career. The 33rd Expeditionary Battalion, the unit that had dismantled a Vreth fortress, held a ridge against impossible odds, and pioneered tactics that the Concord had never imagined, was not an elite unit. It was a standard infantry battalion. Average training, average equipment, average recruitment standards. The humans had not sent their best soldiers to Acheron 7. They had sent their ordinary ones. Thalric wrote, "If this is what ordinary humans are capable of, then the Concord must ensure, at all costs and by all means, that we never see what their best can do. And more importantly, we must never, under any circumstances, give them a reason to show us." Months passed. The report was distributed, debated, classified, and debated again. Policy changed. Humanity was fast-tracked from provisional membership to full Concord status, with a seat on the Strategic Council. Some said it was because the Concord recognized humanity's contribution at Acheron 7. Thalric knew the real reason. Keep something dangerous close, where you could see it, than to push it away and wonder what it was doing. He retired from active service and returned to his home on Kelvor Prime, to a quiet house on a hill overlooking a silver sea. He tried to return to normal life, but normal life felt thin and pale after what he had witnessed. At night he sometimes dreamed of the ridge, the screaming, the charge, the sound of bayonets against chitin. And sometimes he dreamed of the singing, that low, wordless melody in the ruins of the fortress. Humans mourning the dead with a sound that was more beautiful than anything his species had ever composed. One evening, as the sun set over the silver sea and painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Thalric sat at his desk and opened a blank document. He was not writing a report this time. He was writing something personal. A memoir, a record, a warning, a testament. Massacre. And he began to write. "They assigned me to watch the humans fight, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. Not because of the blood, though there was blood enough to drown a world. Not because of the screaming, though it echoes in me still. What haunts me is that when the killing was done, the same creatures that had torn through an army like a force of nature sat down, shared their food with the enemy, and wept for the dead on both sides." He paused, looked out at the darkening sky, and continued, "I have studied war my entire life. I have observed 12 species in combat. I have seen cruelty, efficiency, and destruction beyond measure. But I have never seen anything like humans." He thought of Vasquez and her terrible, beautiful smile. He thought of the sergeant who ran into the kill zone so his squad could live. He thought of the private who fought with one arm and cried afterward, and the soldier who offered him water on the worst night of the battle, with a voice as casual as if they were discussing the weather. He thought of a species that sang for its enemies dead. "They are not warriors," he wrote. "They are not soldiers. They are something the galaxy has no word for. They are creatures that carry violence and kindness in equal measure, and the choice between the two is always theirs, and they always choose. That is what makes them magnificent, and that is what makes them terrifying." He wrote the last lines as the stars came out over the silver sea, and each one looked like a world that humanity might one day reach.